Thousands of women were shaved, beaten, and publicly humiliated after the liberation of Europe. Their crime, having had relationships with German soldiers during the occupation. There was no trial or defense. The accused were dragged out of their homes, paraded through the streets, and made the target of collective rage. In France, at least 20,000 women were shaved. In Norway, many were imprisoned, separated from their children, and diagnosed as mentally unstable. In the Netherlands, they were forced to kneel on manure. These punishments made no distinction between love, convenience, or coercion. Mere suspicion was enough. Why was the punishment focused almost exclusively on women? How did these newly liberated societies channel their collective shame onto female bodies? This is the story of horizontal collaboration, an episode as real as it is uncomfortable, where military victory gave way to a symbolic purge devoid of justice or compassion. The enemy in bed, love, survival, or betrayal. As the Nazi armies advanced inexorably across Europe, a complex and grim reality unfolded behind the front lines. The German occupation brought not only military and political control, but also inevitable social interaction with the local population. In this context, a phenomenon later known as horizontal collaboration emerged, a euphemistic term describing intimate relationships between local women and German soldiers. Survival is a fundamental category for interpreting the behavior of many women during the war, though we must not overlook the fact that some strategically exploited the presence of occupying troops to gain personal benefits. The Third Reich's conquest of European countries was truly swift. German soldiers stormed into the capitals of neighboring nations and behaved as absolute masters of the territory. This permissiveness inevitably affected the personal sphere. Young and strong, many Nazis saw no issue in spending the night with women they found attractive, without concern for the consequences their actions might have on them later. The motivations for these relationships formed a complex spectrum. Some women developed genuine emotional bonds with the occupiers, seeing them not as abstract enemies, but as individual men. Others, pressured by the scarcity and hunger that the war brought with it, found in these relationships a pragmatic means of survival for themselves and their families. In Paris, the city German soldiers longed to visit, more than 30 brothels were established just in the suburbs. Although the German High Command officially tried to control the promiscuity of their personnel, each day more French women woke up in German arms. However, not all relationships occurred in prostitution contexts. Many developed with ordinary women who, for various reasons, began relationships with the occupiers. This reality provoked immediate tensions. The French resistance distributed pamphlets with explicit threats. To the French women who give themselves to the Germans, their hair will be completely shaved off. We will write on their backs, sold to the Germans. When young French women sell their bodies to the Gestapo or the militia, they are selling the blood and soul of their French compatriots. Future wives and mothers are obliged to preserve their purity for love of the homeland. These warnings reflected the deep moral conflict these relationships represented. For many communities, intimacy with the enemy constituted the ultimate frontier of betrayal, a violation not only of national loyalty but also of established moral and social codes. Women, traditionally seen as guardians of virtue and national continuity, bore an additional symbolic burden. The prolonged occupation generated complex dynamics. Some women who had begun relationships with Germans out of necessity later developed emotional bonds. Others maintained emotional detachment while taking advantage of the material benefits these relationships provided: food, protection, medicine, or money, resources unattainable for most of the population. The German military command maintained an ambivalent stance. Officially, they discouraged prolonged fraternization, but in practice, they tolerated it as a safety valve for their troops. In some cases, they even encouraged it as a means of social control, allowing soldiers to form relationships that increased their comfort during the occupation. For the women involved, these decisions occurred in a context of extreme pressure. With local men absent, fighting, imprisoned, or executed, many faced unprecedented family responsibilities. The options were few and all problematic: accept starvation, resort to the black market, or establish relationships with those who controlled the resources. The situation developed regional nuances. In France, where the occupation presented a certain appearance of normalization, These relationships occurred with relative visibility. In Eastern countries, where the Nazi regime implemented more extreme racial policies, interactions happened in different contexts, sometimes forced through eugenics policies or systematic oppression. What united all these experiences was the certainty that, regardless of personal motivations, intimacy with the occupier came at a social cost. The women involved knew they were being watched, judged, and remembered. The war would eventually end, and with it would come the moment of reckoning. Fate was preparing for these unfortunate women the harshest challenges, which they would face during the post-war period. The liberation, so longed for by the occupied nations, would bring with it not only the expulsion of the invader, but also a wave of internal reckonings, where these women would become the visible and accessible target of the collective resentment accumulated over years of national humiliation. The liberation and the lynching, the beginning of public revenge. The liberation of the territories occupied by Nazi Germany brought scenes of joy and celebration that quickly turned into dark episodes of collective revenge. As Allied troops advanced following the Normandy landings in June of 1944, they encountered a disturbing phenomenon that repeated itself in towns and cities across France: the persecution and public punishment of women accused of horizontal collaboration. Allied troops witnessed a troubling spectacle: women being brutally punished for their alleged intimacy with the enemy, subjected to public humiliations that would become a dark stain on the celebration of liberation. In the early hours after the German withdrawal, armed individuals stormed into designated homes and forcibly removed women identified, whether or not there was evidence, as collaborators. The procedure followed a recognizable pattern. The women were dragged to public squares where their ritualized humiliation began. War correspondent Robert Capa documented these scenes, noting, "I found myself at the front of the procession, and the local people thought I was the soldier who had captured them, and I was kissed and congratulated at the same time that slaps and spit rained down on the unfortunate girls." The violence did not stop at shaving. The women were then paraded through the streets, exposed to public humiliation. In many cases, their clothes were partially or entirely torn off, increasing their vulnerability before the hostile crowd. Jock Colville, Churchill's private secretary, observed, "I saw an open truck go by, accompanied by boos and whistles from the French population, with a dozen miserable women in the back. Every hair on their heads shaved. They were in tears, bowing their heads in shame. Though disgusted by this cruelty, I reflected that we British had not known invasion or occupation for about 900 years, so we were not the best judges." These acts occurred with greater intensity in areas where the occupation had been particularly oppressive, or where the resistance had suffered severe reprisals. The line between popular justice and uncontrolled revenge became blurred. Accusations were often based on rumors, anonymous reports, or personal vendettas. Some women were denounced by envious neighbors, others by local men they had previously rejected and who now saw an opportunity for revenge. Violence reached extreme levels in some localities. In Paris, there were cases of prostitutes and women kicked to death for accepting German soldiers as clients. Even members of the aristocracy were shaved for associating with German officers. The hatred accumulated during years of occupation found a release in accessible and vulnerable victims. The Allied forces maintained an ambivalent stance toward these episodes. Although many soldiers found these acts disturbing, there was a certain understanding of the suffering that France had endured under occupation. Allied military authorities generally did not intervene, considering these episodes as internal French matters during a moment of political transition. A particularly unsettling element was the near-total absence of legal scrutiny during these processes. Women were summarily executed if found with German weapons in their possession, without being given the opportunity to explain the circumstances. There was a widespread fear of collaboration, fueled by rumors such as the report from an American lieutenant of the 1st Infantry Division who claimed to have found 4 women in German uniforms as snipers in trees and 5 inside a village. The phenomenon spread rapidly throughout liberated France during the summer and fall of 1944. Estimates indicate that at least 20,000 women were publicly shaved, although the actual number could be significantly higher. What began as spontaneous acts gradually became institutionalized, turning into a form of symbolic purification of the nation, a public exorcism of the shame of occupation. This first wave of extrajudicial punishments would eventually give way to more formalized processes as civil authorities regained control. However, the damage was already done. Thousands of women were marked physically and psychologically by these episodes, while France began its complex process of national reconstruction and reckoning with its recent past. The Carnival of Shame, the ritual of punishment. Public punishments of women accused of horizontal collaboration evolved into such a widespread and ritualized phenomenon that it received a name of its own: the ugly carnivals. This term captured the grotesque and spectacular nature of events that combined elements of popular justice, collective catharsis, and social control over the female body. The ritual followed an almost ceremonial sequence. The central moment was the shaving of hair, a symbolic act with deep historical roots. Female hair, traditionally associated with beauty and sexuality, was removed as a visible mark of transgression. This act turned the accused into public spectacles, instantly recognizable as guilty to any observer. The execution of the punishment usually began with an improvised arrest. Groups of men, often self-proclaimed last-minute resistance fighters, would burst into designated homes. The women were forcibly removed, sometimes directly from their beds, other times in the middle of their daily activities. The element of surprise heightened the humiliation, denying the victims any chance of physical or psychological preparation. The carnival continued with a forced parade. The punished women were made to walk through the main streets, often mounted on open trucks to increase their visibility. The crowd actively participated, hurling insults, spitting, and in many cases physically assaulting the victims. This procession served multiple purposes: publicly exposing the punished, warning potential transgressors, and allowing collective participation in the punitive act. Testimonies highlight the particular cruelty of these parades. The collaborators were made to run the gauntlet and were really beaten. The women not only faced public humiliation, but also physical assaults that in some cases resulted in serious or fatal injuries. The violence was justified as a legitimate expression of patriotic outrage, a deserved punishment for the most unforgivable transgression: intimacy with the enemy. The performative dimension of these punishments was essential. It was not enough to punish. The punishment had to be visible, memorable, and exemplary. For this reason, photographers were called in to document the acts, producing images that would circulate as evidence of the restoration of moral order. These photographs, showing shaved women with downcast faces surrounded by enthusiastic crowds, are now disturbing historical documents. Popular participation in these rituals reveals complex dimensions. Alongside genuine indignation coexisted less noble motivations: opportunism, personal vendettas, or simple social conformity. Many participants had maintained ambiguous positions during the occupation, and their enthusiasm for the punishment served as a public demonstration of patriotic loyalty, a way to distance themselves from any suspicion of collaboration. What is particularly significant in these carnivals of shame is their almost exclusive focus on women. Although there were cases of men being shaved for working in German factories, women constituted the overwhelming majority of victims. This disparity reveals how female sexual collaboration was perceived as especially transgressive, threatening not only national integrity but also patriarchal structures that assigned women the role of guardians of familial and collective purity. Public punishments were not distributed equally among all the accused. Social class, personal connections, and specific circumstances significantly influenced outcomes. Women from humble backgrounds without protective networks were more accessible targets than those from privileged classes. However, even aristocrats were occasionally humiliated, showing how, in moments of collective purification, few were entirely safe. A particularly tragic aspect was the inclusion of innocent victims. Women who had been raped by German soldiers or who had merely engaged in necessary professional interactions, such as teachers forced to house officers, were punished indiscriminately. The zeal for purification often outweighed any concern for individual justice. Norway, the Netherlands, Italy, and Poland: prison, exile, and asylums. The phenomenon of punishing women who had relationships with German occupiers was not exclusive to France. In other liberated European countries, These women faced systematic reprisals that, while sharing symbolic elements with the French experience, took on distinctive characteristics shaped by specific cultural, political, and legal contexts. In Norway, the response to horizontal collaboration took particularly severe institutionalized forms. After the liberation, Norwegian authorities pursued former lovers of Nazis with a zeal comparable to the French, but through more legally formalized methods. Women identified as collaborators received actual sentences that could extend up to 5 years, during which they were sent to forced labor in extremely harsh conditions. The Norwegian system was especially relentless, with mothers of children fathered by German soldiers. In the Scandinavian kingdom, over 7,000 children were born to German fathers, a proportionally significant number given the country's population. When the mothers were sentenced and confined to correctional institutions, the children were sent to special orphanages where their names were often changed to prevent their mothers from finding them after completing their sentences. Some Norwegian women showed extraordinary persistence and, despite the obstacles, located their children and demanded their return. However, they then faced an unforgiving judicial system that systematically ruled against them. Judges openly stated they would never allow custody to be restored, suggesting that the best alternative was to permanently relinquish their children. Those who continued their legal battles faced additional resistance. New cases were opened against them, and they were frequently subjected to medical evaluations where doctors issued appropriate diagnoses, declaring them mentally unstable and confining them to psychiatric hospitals for extended periods, sometimes for life. The Norwegian system treated these women more harshly than any other occupied country. Paradoxically, they were considered more serious traitors than those who had openly supported fascism or fought against their compatriots. This severity reflected an urgency to restore the national image, portraying Norway as a country that had unanimously participated in the resistance against the fascist invaders, with no traitors among its ranks. Women who had relationships with Germans, especially those who had given birth to children from these unions, contradicted this purifying narrative and had to be erased from the historical record. In the Netherlands, punishments inflicted on accused women followed patterns similar to those in France, focusing on public humiliation. Collaborators were made to kneel on manure, shaved, and their heads dyed orange, the Dutch national colour, in a symbolic appropriation marking their transgression as an offence to national identity. The popular reaction was equally ruthless. Villagers systematically insulted and oppressed them, while their children were constantly mistreated, reminded at every turn that their mothers were traitors. For many of these Dutch women, the only salvation was relocating. They left their homes taking only their children and a few belongings. Selling property proved unviable due to widespread public hostility, and bank officials refused to grant them loans, extending the persecution into the economic realm and condemning them to structural precariousness. Unlike in other territories where the punishment of collaborators began after the German withdrawal, in Italy these acts of revenge began even before the end of the war, marking not only a reckoning with the foreign occupier, but also with a fascist regime that had ruled for more than 20 years. The Italian women who were shaved were not only those involved with Germans, but also wives, girlfriends, or relatives of Republican fascists, creating a broader and politically more complex category of traitors. Testimonies collected in Italy refer to these acts as a necessary national cleansing to facilitate the rebirth of a long-tormented country. However, this collective justification cannot hide the specific injustices suffered by women punished frequently for familial associations rather than for their own actions. The situation in Belgium also deserves particular attention. During the Second World War, thousands of children were born in Belgian territory from relationships between Wehrmacht soldiers and local women. Most of these children of the war were conceived within voluntary relationships, often genuine emotional bonds. Unlike the First World War, when German troops terrorized the civilian population, the Wehrmacht had strict orders to behave courteously toward women, and rape was punished. German soldiers were not allowed to marry women from occupied countries during the war. Their companions, prevented from becoming legitimate wives, were left alone, often pregnant, in the midst of shame and social isolation. Some chose to abandon their children in orphanages or give them up for adoption, seeking to regain a normal life and hoping for a future for their children free from stigma. Others decided to keep them despite the difficulties and suffering they would face, though their ability to care for the children was constantly questioned. During childhood, mothers tended to hide their children's German ancestry. Answering questions that the children asked, often driven by curiosity or the malice of their peers, meant renewing the feeling of shame and admitting to faults they had not committed. Most only discovered their paternal origins in adulthood. Some managed to meet their fathers, while others never had the chance to know even their biological mothers. In all these countries, the persecution of horizontal collaborators reveals common patterns that transcend national particularities. The female body became a symbolic battlefield where issues of national loyalty, moral purity, and identity reconstruction were played out. Women, considered bearers of collective honor, bore a disproportionate burden in the processes of national purification. The institutionalization of these punishments, from public rituals to formal judicial procedures, demonstrates how the persecution went beyond spontaneous impulses to become a systematic mechanism of national reconstruction. By visibly and exemplarily punishing transgressors, newly liberated communities marked moral boundaries and reaffirmed collective values after the trauma of occupation. Particularly revealing is the disparity between the treatment of political or economic collaborators, predominantly men, and sexual or romantic collaborators, women. While many male collaborators negotiated amnesties, received reduced sentences, or benefited from formal legal processes with procedural guarantees, women faced summary trials, immediate punishments, and permanent stigmatization, with no chance of social reintegration. The case of Lida Barova, a Czechoslovak actress who had a relationship with Joseph Goebbels, illustrates another dimension of this phenomenon. Born as Ludmila Babkova, Barova quickly rose in the interwar Czechoslovak film world. Her fame spread internationally, and in 1936 she was hired by UFA, the most important film studio of the Third Reich. There she met Goebbels, with whom she began an affair so intense that Hitler himself had to intervene. When Barova returned to her country, it had been transformed into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, controlled by the Nazis. She continued her career while maintaining contacts with German officers, and in 1943 she sought fortune in Mussolini's Italy. After the Allied advance, fearing reprisals, she fled to Germany. Captured by American troops, she feigned mental illness and was admitted to a sanatorium in Munich. In September of 1945, she was extradited to Czechoslovakia and imprisoned on charges of espionage. Although declared innocent, she was banned from working in Czechoslovak cinema and had her villa in Prague confiscated. This case illustrates how public figures romantically linked to high-ranking Nazis faced significant consequences, though generally less severe than those suffered by anonymous women. This disproportion reflects how female collaboration was fundamentally perceived as moral betrayal, a symbolic contamination that threatened national reconstruction, while male collaboration was evaluated primarily in pragmatic terms. The punished women not only atoned for their individual decisions, but also served as scapegoats to purge the collective shame of societies that, to varying degrees, had negotiated their coexistence with the occupiers. Children of the enemy, children born of sin, the shadow of horizontal collaboration extended beyond the women directly involved, reaching the thousands of children born from relationships between local women and German soldiers. These children, innocent of any decision or circumstance surrounding their conception, became living reminders of a time the liberated nations sought to overcome, facing systematic discrimination and institutional abandonment. The numbers reveal the scale of the phenomenon. According to estimates, approximately 200,000 babies were born in France to German fathers and French mothers, of which 80,000 were officially registered with German paternity according to German records. In Norway, around 12,000 children were born from these relationships, and even in the small Channel Islands, 900 births to German fathers were recorded. These figures, likely conservative, reveal a widespread phenomenon that would later be subject to historical and social silencing. The fate of these children varied depending on national contexts, but they shared a common condition: being perceived as the physical extension of the enemy, bearers of a genetic and symbolic contamination. In France, the treatment toward them was relatively less severe than toward their mothers. Official measures were limited to prohibiting them from learning German and bearing German names, although many could not escape abuse from peers and adults. Social stigma led many mothers to abandon their babies, who were raised in orphanages where they often received discriminatory treatment. In Norway, the situation took on particularly cruel characteristics. The children of German-Norwegian relationships were declared illegitimate, and when their mothers were imprisoned, were sent to special institutions where their identities were systematically altered. The name changes aimed to make it impossible for their mothers to find them after serving their sentences, implementing a definitive separation as an additional punishment for the traitors and as a supposedly protective measure for Norwegian society. This Norwegian system of forced institutionalization revealed a deliberate political project: the systematic elimination of the German stain from the population. The children, innocent yet marked by their origin, were subjected to policies combining eugenic and nationalist elements. Medical and social authorities labeled these children as potentially dangerous due to their genetic heritage, suggesting predispositions to antisocial or criminal behavior based solely on their paternal lineage. In the Netherlands, children born from these relationships faced constant discrimination. Derisively nicknamed Moffenkinderen, German kids, or NSB-kinderen, children of the Dutch Nazi Party, they suffered social isolation, systematic bullying, and exclusion from educational and social opportunities. Their mothers, economically marginalized, faced additional difficulties in providing adequate care, creating intergenerational cycles of vulnerability. Among the most surprising stories about these children of the enemy is that of Annie-Fried Lyngstad, later known worldwide as Frida, member of the musical group ABBA. Born on November 15, 1945, 6 months after the end of the war, Frida was the daughter of Sinni Lyngstad, a young Norwegian woman, and Alfred Hase, a Wehrmacht soldier. What is particularly significant about her case is that she was a direct product of the Lebensborn, Fountain of Life program, created by Heinrich Himmler to biologically expand Nazi ideology. This program encouraged German soldiers to have children with racially suitable women in occupied territories, considering Norwegians especially close to the Aryan ideal. Frida's birth in the Norwegian village of Bjorkesen made her one of approximately 12,000 children born in Norway under this program. After 2 years of discrimination and social marginalization, during which the little girl was called the German bastard, Sinni emigrated with her daughter to Sweden. Frida's mother died shortly after arriving, leaving the girl in the care of her grandmother, Arntine. Throughout her childhood and adolescence, Frida believed her father had died in a shipwreck, completely unaware of her origins linked to the Lebensborn program. Only at the height of her fame with ABBA did a German fan reveal to her that her father was still alive. The meeting between Frida and Alfred Hase, organized with great media coverage, turned out to be cold and artificial. "I can't love him as if he had been with us while I was growing up," the singer later confessed, and she never spoke publicly about the subject again. Frida's case illustrates the identity complexities these children faced. The late discovery of stigmatized origins, the impossibility of rebuilding fragmented family ties, and the paradox of reconciling a successful public identity with a personal history marked by collective trauma. Ironically, the Norwegian girl conceived in a Nazi experiment to create a superior race, who suffered exile and rejection, would later become a member of the German royal family after marrying Prince Heinrich Rutzow-Reuss von Plauen, obtaining the title of Serene Highness. A particularly disturbing dimension of the treatment of these children was their systematic pathologization. In Norway, the influential psychiatrist Ornulf Odegaard propagated the pseudoscientific theory that children of Germans inherently suffered from mental disorders. His studies, deeply biased, claimed that between 50 and 60% of children born to Norwegian mothers and German fathers had cognitive deficiencies. These diagnoses, driven more by political prejudice than clinical evidence, led to the forced institutionalization of numerous children in psychiatric centers where they remained for years, some for life. This pseudoscience served multiple ideological purposes. It justified the marginalization of these children by presenting them as biologically defective, reinforced narratives about the degeneration associated with German genetic contamination, and provided a scientific veneer for discriminatory policies. Mothers who attempted to reclaim their institutionalized children faced medical committees that systematically recommended keeping the separations, arguing maternal incapacity due to hereditary mental instability or antisocial tendencies. The impact of this pathologization transcended generations. Many survivors, now elderly, describe lasting psychological consequences: anxiety disorders, difficulties forming emotional bonds, and persistent feelings of inadequacy, all exacerbated by clinical interventions based more on prejudice than genuine therapeutic needs. The case of Monika Diedrich exemplifies the identity complexities faced by these children. Born in Germany to a Dutch mother and a German father severely wounded in the war, Monika experienced a double displacement. After her father's death in 1947, she and her mother returned to the Netherlands, where they immediately encountered border issues due to her German paternity. Although they managed to settle in Amsterdam, where her mother married a Dutchman in an effort to erase the past, Monika continued to endure school bullying and persistent questioning about her origins. Her response was to resign herself in silence to preserve her mental well-being. Only decades later did Monika channel these experiences into works such as Whoever is Being Shaved Must Sit Still, 2006, and her autobiography Memories of a German Girl, 2012, documenting both her personal experience and that of other children of the enemy. Gerlinde Swillen, a French-speaking Belgian citizen, daughter of a Flemish mother and a German soldier, represents another revealing case. Her search for the truth intensified in 2007 when her elderly mother finally revealed the name of her father, Karl. In her autobiographical book, The Cuckoo Child Conceived by the Enemy, 1940-1945, Swillen reconstructs not only her personal story, but also that of approximately 70 Belgian children of the war, revealing consistent patterns of marginalization, idealization of the absent father, and frustrated searches for acceptance. Particularly significant are Swillen's observations about Belgian women's perceptions of German soldiers. Contrary to the dominant narrative of universally hated occupiers, the women interviewed by Swillen often described the Germans as young and handsome men, charming in their uniforms and courteous, in contrast to local men perceived as rougher and less generous. These perspectives complicate the simplistic understanding of relationships during the occupation, revealing human dimensions that later nationalist narratives sought to erase. The legal implications of being a child of the enemy went beyond social stigma. Until 1969, German law completely excluded illegitimate children from paternal inheritance, not recognizing them as legitimate descendants. After the legal reform implemented in 1970, this right was granted to natural children, but those born before 1949, who had already turned 21 by the time the law came into force, were explicitly excluded. This selective exclusion affected precisely the children of the war, reinforcing their institutionalized marginalization. Many descendants report that their German paternal families rejected meetings for fear of potential inheritance claims, although most of these children were primarily seeking identity recognition rather than material benefits. Only in recent decades have formal initiatives emerged to address these historical injustices. In 2005, Delord Hoffmann founded in France the association Cœur Sans Frontières, Heart Without Borders, which brings together children born to French mothers and German soldiers, offering concrete assistance in tracing origins and obtaining dual nationality. The association's secretary, Chantal Lecrec, herself a child of shame, eloquently expresses the purpose of these initiatives. Living without roots is like living halfway. I finally got to tell my story, but I had already lived my life. I did it too late. But even if it's too late for us, we are here to help others, those being born now. We are here so they don't feel alone, so they don't have to suffer what we have suffered. A loveless childhood is an abyss of loneliness that takes years to climb out of. The social isolation experienced by these children transcended national borders, constituting a shared, traumatic experience that has only recently begun to be historically acknowledged. Many grew up unaware of their origins, raised with fabricated stories about fictitious or deceased fathers, discovering their true ancestry accidentally during adolescence or adulthood, often with devastating psychological effects. Educational and social institutions actively contributed to this discrimination. Teachers, social workers, and local authorities, acting as guardians of the reconstructed national purity, implemented subtle or explicit forms of exclusion. Children quickly learned to hide their origins, developing fragmented identities and internalized feelings of shame that would shape their lives. Particularly painful was the identity limbo these children inhabited, rejected by their maternal countries as representatives of the enemy, yet simultaneously deprived of any connection to their paternal heritage. This double denial constituted a form of symbolic violence that compromised their psychosocial development and sense of belonging. The treatment of these children reflects how post-liberation European societies selectively managed their historical memory, creating categories of legitimate and illegitimate victims. While some groups received recognition and reparations, others, like these children, were condemned to systematic silencing that denied both their suffering and their very existence as a specific historical category. The exclusion of these children from the official historical narrative of the occupation and post-war period represents a significant distortion in the construction of European national memories. Their gradual visibility in recent decades, through testimonies, survivor associations, and specialized historical studies, constitutes an act of historical justice and a necessary complication of previously simplified narratives of victims and perpetrators. The Coco Chanel case and other public figures, privilege and collaboration. The application of punishments to horizontal collaborators reveals deep inequalities of class and privilege. While ordinary women were publicly humiliated and punished with extreme severity, prominent figures such as fashion designer Coco Chanel almost entirely avoided consequences for their relationships with the occupiers. Chanel maintained intimate relations with the German secret agent and Hitler's trusted man at the German embassy in Paris, Baron Hans Günther von Dinklage, even before the war, and did not hesitate to continue them during the occupation. The couple lived openly in a luxurious suite at the Hotel Ritz, and there are well-founded suspicions that Chanel even worked as a spy for the Germans. Her collaboration went beyond the personal to include business interests. The Jewish Wertheimer family owned 90% of the rights to Chanel perfumes, a financial contribution without which Coco would never have launched production. The Aryanization laws imposed by the Nazi regime aligned perfectly with her commercial interests. When the Wertheimers fled France, and despite having previously transferred their share to non-Jewish friends, Chanel maneuvered with the help of her Nazi contacts to try to acquire the entire business. What happened to Coco after the liberation of France? Unlike thousands of anonymous women who suffered shaving, violence, and social exclusion, Chanel simply left France. With the help of her lover von Dinklage, she traveled to neutral Switzerland, where she remained until 1954, when she considered it safe to return. Surprisingly, upon her return to relaunch her brand, it was precisely the Wertheimers who supported her financially, in a complex business transaction that transcended personal grievances. This contrast between the fate of ordinary women and privileged figures like Chanel illustrates how post-war justice operated selectively, punishing the vulnerable while allowing the powerful to use their connections and resources to avoid consequences. The Chanel case represents a paradigmatic example of how privilege not only enabled escape from punishment, but also allowed for the later capitalization on a rehabilitated reputation, transforming a history of collaboration into a narrative of survival and business acumen. Justice or revenge, memory, oblivion, and forgiveness. 8 decades after the events, the persecution of women accused of horizontal collaboration remains one of the most problematic episodes in the narrative of European liberation. What was initially justified as a necessary national purification reveals, under historical scrutiny, complex dimensions where justice, revenge, and social control became inextricably intertwined. After the public judgment, the fate of these women followed diverse but consistently marginal trajectories, physically marked by shaving, which took months to recover from, and socially by public humiliation. Many found reintegration into their original communities impossible. The stigma persisted long after their hair had grown back, manifesting in job exclusion, social ostracism, and often structural impoverishment. To understand this phenomenon beyond its immediate manifestation, it is necessary to analyze the multiple functions these punishments served. The public humiliation of sexual collaborators fulfilled purposes that went beyond mere retribution. It functioned as a mechanism for collective identity reconstruction. Nations that had experienced humiliating military defeats and prolonged occupations needed to symbolically reaffirm their retrospective resistance, creating clear categories of heroes and traitors. The punished women served as ideal scapegoats, visible, vulnerable, and with transgressions easily comprehensible to popular audiences. By focusing guilt on them, entire communities that had negotiated various forms of everyday coexistence with the occupiers could externalize their own moral ambiguity. Violence against these women thus functioned as a purifying ritual, allowing deeply compromised societies to retrospectively fantasize about unanimous resistance. The gender component is inescapable in this analysis. While economic and political collaborators, predominantly men, frequently avoided severe punishment through formal judicial processes, selective amnesties, or simply by leveraging influential connections, sexual collaborators faced summary justice without procedural guarantees. This disparity reveals how female collaboration was judged under absolute moral standards, while male collaboration was evaluated through pragmatic and contextual considerations. The disproportionate focus on punishing horizontal collaboration also reflects patriarchal structures in which the female body symbolized national honor. Intimacy with the enemy metaphorically represented the penetration and conquest of the nation itself. Spectacularly punishing the transgressors reaffirmed male control over female bodies presented as collective national property. Were they true collaborators or victims of impossible circumstances? The answer escapes simplistic categorization. Among those punished were diverse profiles. Some developed genuine emotional bonds with German soldiers, seeing them as individual men rather than abstract representatives of the enemy. Others entered into pragmatic relationships, seeking material survival in contexts of extreme scarcity. Some were coerced or raped, while others opportunistically took advantage of the benefits associated with these relationships. No mitigating circumstance, not even material desperation or coercion, was considered relevant in popular trials. The dominant narrative established an irreconcilable dichotomy: patriotic resistors versus traitorous collaborators, leaving no room for gradation or context. This moral simplification functioned effectively for communities processing complex collective traumas. Formal legal proceedings, when they occurred, often replicated these biases. In Norway, courts established with a semblance of legality systematically condemned these women based on their sexual conduct as sufficient evidence of treason. The jurisprudence developed specifically criminalized personal associations that, for men in comparable situations, did not necessarily constitute crimes. Historian Fabrice Virgili, a pioneer in documenting these episodes, points out how these punishments reveal mechanisms of social control where female sexuality becomes a public matter when it crosses national borders. Intimacy, normally considered private, became a political issue when it involved the enemy, thus justifying communal interventions into individual women's bodies. Paradoxically, while women were severely punished for consensual relationships with Germans, the mass rapes perpetrated by Allied troops, particularly Soviet but also Western, went unpunished and were rarely officially acknowledged. This inconsistency reveals that the primary concern was not the protection of women, but the regulation of their sexuality in accordance with national interests. The official post-war memory systematically silenced these episodes. Heroic constructions of unanimous resistance were incompatible with acknowledging both widespread collaboration and the subsequent punitive excesses. France, Norway, and other countries built national narratives in which these events remained as marginal notes, unworthy of inclusion in the main storyline. This historiographical silence only began to crack in the 1970s and 1980s, when new generations of historians, shaped by feminist and micro-historical perspectives, began to recover these episodes as significant elements for understanding the moral complexities of occupation and liberation. Pioneering publications such as L'Attendu, 1991, by Philippe Baudrel, and later Les Tantes, 2006, by Alain Brossat, initiated a critical recovery that continues to expand. Particularly revealing is the near-total absence of reparation or official recognition for these victims. While other groups affected by the war gradually received institutional apologies, financial compensation, or symbolic acknowledgement, the shaved women and their children remained illegitimate victims, excluded from reparative policies and official commemorations. Only recently have initiatives emerged to integrate these experiences into more inclusive historical narratives. Documentaries like Les Tantes de la Libération, 2014, and thematic museum exhibitions have contributed to making these episodes visible, contextualizing them critically but empathetically. These revisions do not aim to relativize collaborationist responsibilities, but rather to understand the moral complexity of decisions made under occupation and to question the disproportionality and gender bias in the punishments applied. The survivors of these episodes, when able to testify, reveal devastating lifelong impacts. Many describe lives marked by depression, social isolation, and economic hardship, often worsened by the forced separation from their children. Some built entirely new identities in distant towns, severing all ties with their original communities. Others remained in their hometowns, enduring prolonged stigmatization, moving through social spaces as ghostly presences, tolerated yet permanently marginalized. The specific case of the children of the enemy reveals intergenerational dimensions of collective trauma. Recent psychosocial research documents how these individuals, now elderly, continue to process fragmented identities and inherited stigmas. Some have formed associations to advocate for recognition and share experiences, such as Norway's Krigsbarnforbundet, War Children Association, which since 1986 has fought for visibility and redress. Critically integrating these episodes into Europe's contemporary collective memory presents significant challenges. Acknowledging the moral complexity of the occupation means questioning simplified heroic narratives without minimizing real acts of collaboration. At the same time, critically analyzing the punishments applied requires contextualizing, without justifying, acts that by today's standards would clearly constitute fundamental human rights violations. Philosopher Paul Ricoeur's concept of just memory proposes a balance between remembering and forgetting, between condemnation and understanding. Applied to these episodes, it suggests the need to recognize both the problematic nature of certain forms of collaboration and the disproportion and gender bias in their punishment, integrating both dimensions into nuanced historical narratives. Among the various motivations that led women into relationships with German soldiers during the war, the most simple and banal, love, has often been systematically erased. Some relationships were reckless or naive love affairs, but genuine nonetheless. These stories were scrubbed from the record, just as attempts were made to erase the children of shame born from them. One disturbing aspect is the contrast between the harsh persecution of consensual relationships with Germans and the near-total impunity for mass rapes perpetrated by Allied troops. This inconsistency reveals that the primary concern was not protecting women, but regulating their sexuality in line with national interests. A woman who freely chose the wrong enemy was more condemnable than a friendly soldier who raped local women. The associations formed by war children across various European countries have played a fundamental role in bringing these silenced stories to light. Organizations like Coeur Sans Frontières in France, Krigsbarnforbundet in Norway, and the research efforts of Monica Diedrich in the Netherlands have helped recover testimonies, facilitate searches for paternal origins, and pressure for institutional recognition. These initiatives represent forms of restorative justice, offering spaces to narrate long-silenced experiences. Contemporary European democracies face the challenge of incorporating these episodes into their foundational narratives without completely destabilizing them. Paradoxically, the recognition of these historical injustices strengthens today's commitments to principles such as due process, proportional punishment, and gender equality, demonstrating institutional learning from acknowledged historical errors. Ultimately, these episodes reveal the collective moral fragility in post-traumatic contexts. Newly liberated communities, processing experiences of occupation, defeat, and widespread collaboration, projected collective anxieties onto accessible scapegoats. Summary justice against sexual collaborators provided immediate catharsis and fantasies of national purification when more complex forms of reckoning proved unbearable. 8 decades later, the critical integration of these episodes into Europe's historical consciousness enables a deeper understanding of the moral complexities that characterize transitions from oppressive regimes toward democratic reconstruction. The punishments of women who slept with the enemy remain a disturbing reminder of how liberation simultaneously contained seeds of both justice and revenge, where the ideals of democratic restoration coexisted with punitive impulses that reproduced precisely the dehumanizing logics they were meant to overcome.